February 1943. Canvas tent behind the Tunisian front. A German engineer picks up a bolt from a workbench. He turns it over in his fingers. He sees, stamped into the metal, a single letter, the letter F, in the next. 4 seconds without saying a word, that man understands why Germany is going to lose the war. Not the war of tanks and rifles and armies. The other war. The one underneath. The one that had already been decided 120 years earlier in a place he had never heard of by men whose names he would never know. Before we go any further, one thing has to be said out loud. There is no famous document from that afternoon, no stamped report, no signed dispatch that survived. If someone in that tent wrote down what they found, it did not come through the war. And this story is not going to invent one for you. What we have instead is better. What we have is what was actually on the bench. Because if you had been standing in that tent in February of 1943 and you had watched those men work, you would have seen exactly what they saw. And you would have understood. The tent smells of engine oil and desert dust. Outside, the wind carries the fine sand of central Tunisia across the canvas walls in a low, constant hiss. Inside, under a single hanging bulb powered by a generator that coughs every few minutes, a small group of Wehrmacht workshop specialists is about to do something ordinary. They are going to take a captured enemy vehicle apart, lay every piece of it on the workbench, and look at what the enemy has been building. The vehicle is small, ugly by any European standard, flat fenders, folded windshield, bare metal seats, no mounted weapon, a canvas top that most crews throw away within a week of receiving it. The whole thing weighs about 1,000 kilograms. 4 men can pick it up. 4 men can turn it around by hand. It is a Willys MB. The Americans call it a Jeep. The Germans have seen these before. They have been arriving in North Africa with the British for over a year now, sent across the Atlantic under a program called Lend-Lease. But something has changed in the last 2 weeks. Now there are dozens of them. Now there are spare parts crated up in the dust. Now there is time. Because the Americans have just suffered their first major defeat of the war. And they lost it badly enough that they left almost everything behind. Brings us to the bench. An engineer, a Wehrmacht workshop specialist whose name is not preserved, reaches for a wrench. He begins with the engine block. He removes the intake manifold, removes the head. He works methodically. This is his craft. He was trained in it before the war, in a factory somewhere in Germany, by men who had themselves been trained by men who had built the first automobiles in history. He belongs to a tradition of engineering that stretches back 3 generations and produced some of the finest machines the world has ever seen. He knows metal. He knows tolerances. He knows what good work looks like. He is not impressed. The castings are rough. The machining marks are visible where a German factory would have polished them out. This is not a masterpiece. This is a car built by people who did not care about elegance. He almost smiles. Bolt. He sees the letter F, small stamped script letter, on the head of the bolt. F. He sets it down. He picks up another bolt from the same assembly. No letter. 3rd. F again. F. 4th. Nothing. Calls another engineer over. Parts on the bench. Some pieces have the mark. Some pieces do not. And this is the moment. This is the exact moment. Because these men know their industry. They know what that letter means. Ford Motor Company, Dearborn, Michigan. The parts without the mark come from Willys Overland, Toledo, Ohio. Different companies. Hundreds of miles apart. Competitors, rivals, who had bid against each other for the government contract. Parts are in the same vehicle, fitted together, working. Nobody has filed anything to make them fit. Nobody has shimmed anything. No craftsman has sat it with a micrometer, matching a bearing to a housing by hand the way a German craftsman would. Parts fit because they were made to fit, 4,000 miles away, by machines, by two organizations that did not like each other and did not need to. The engineer in the tent understands the implication in about 4 seconds, because he has been trying to do exactly this in Germany for 5 years, and he has failed. Everyone he works with has failed. Now he is looking at proof, yes, sitting on a folding table in a canvas tent in the Tunisian desert, that on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, someone has already solved the problem. He does not say it out loud. He does not need to. The other engineers in the tent have picked up their own bolts. They have seen the same letter. And in that silence, under the hanging bulb, canvas tent, in the middle of a desert war, 5 or 6 men of the finest engineering tradition in Europe are looking at the same object and reaching the same conclusion. They are running out of time. The Americans have not even started yet. We will come back to what he understood. We will come back to why the failure was so complete. But first, we need to understand how these jeeps ended up in a German workshop at all. Because the road to that bench begins with the worst defeat the United States Army suffered in the entire Western War. Rewind 10 days. February the 14th, 1943. Central Tunisia, a mountain pass called Kasserine. Yes, the American Second Corps has been in the country for a few months. It is commanded by a 59-year-old lieutenant general named Lloyd Fredendall. Fredendall is a difficult man. He speaks in his own private code over the radio, which nobody can understand. He gives orders using nicknames for units that his own officers have to decipher. And he has chosen to run the battle from a bunker complex his engineers have been ordered to blast into the side of a mountain, roughly 100 kilometers behind the front line. Troops call it Speedy Valley. Do not mean it as a compliment. Facing him on the German side is a 51-year-old field marshal named Erwin Rommel, Desert Fox, or a man who by this point in the war has been fighting in North Africa for almost 2 years, and who has forgotten more about desert warfare than the American command has yet learned. Rommel has been pushed back across Libya. His supply situation is collapsing. Spotted something. Spotted that the Americans in Tunisia are green, untested, poorly positioned. Commander is not at the front. Hit them. On the morning of February the 14th, elements of the 10th and the 21st Panzer Divisions come pouring through the mountain gaps of central Tunisia. They hit the American positions with the kind of coordinated armored assault that the Wehrmacht has spent 3 years perfecting on the Russian steppe. The Americans have never seen anything like it. Imagine what it sounds like. If you have ever stood near a diesel locomotive at full throttle, you have some idea. Multiply it by 50. Panzer IV tanks moving at speed across hard-packed desert. The rumble carries for miles before you see anything. Then the dust cloud on the horizon. Then the crack of the 88mm guns, which fire so flat and so fast that the sound of the shell arriving comes before the sound of the shell leaving. American tank crews, most of them men who had never heard a shot fired in anger before that week, hear the 88 and hear their own tank commanders shouting orders through headsets, and then hear nothing, because the Sherman or the Lee next to them has just been hit through the front plate and is burning. Line breaks. Over the next 10 days, from February the 14th, the Farrakhan's Second Corps is driven backward through the mountains of central Tunisia in what military historians now agree was the most humiliating American defeat of the Second World War. Killed, wounded, missing, captured, come to roughly 6,000 men. Units are scattered across 30 miles of desert. Command posts are overrun. Radio nets collapse. And in the panic of the retreat, the Americans abandon equipment on a scale that makes German intelligence officers openly happy. Trucks, half-tracks, anti-tank guns, radios, rations, jeeps, hundreds of jeeps, some shot up, some out of fuel, some abandoned intact with the keys still in them. Hold that image in your head, because this is the twist that runs underneath the entire story. In the middle of the worst defeat the United States Army suffers in the Western War, in the middle of 6,000 American casualties and a broken line and a general who is about to be quietly relieved of command, the thing the Germans capture that will actually explain how they lose the war is not a tank, it is not an artillery piece, it is not a radio, all ugly car with folded fenders and no armor. They just do not know that yet. Rommel does not know it. He is celebrating the greatest tactical victory of the North African campaign, preparing to push further. He is preparing to break the Allied position in Tunisia altogether, which he has no idea that in a workshop tent behind his own lines, a handful of his own engineers are about to see the future. And to understand what those engineers see, you have to leave the Tunisian desert entirely, to go back 3 years. Small town in western Pennsylvania called Butler, Pennsylvania, June of 1940. France is falling for weeks. The German army, which was supposed to break itself against the Maginot Line the way it broke itself in the last war, has instead swept around the north end of the line and driven a spear through the heart of the French command. Paris will be occupied within days. The British Expeditionary Force has just been evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving most of its equipment on the beach. In Washington, in London, in every capital that is watching, the same question is being asked. How long until it is us? The States Army is not ready. Remotely, the American military in 1940 ranks 17th in the world by size, behind Romania, behind Bulgaria, has almost no modern armor, has almost no modern aircraft, and it has a transport problem that officers have been complaining about for a decade. Scout cars in service are old, slow, two-wheel drive, built on civilian chassis that cannot handle rough country, so the Army issues a requirement. The specification, short, direct, almost hostile in its demands. They want a light reconnaissance car, four-wheel drive, payload of 600 pounds, wheelbase under 80 inches. Oh, a weight limit so low that every automotive engineer in the United States, when they see it on paper, laughs out loud. Physically impossible. Nobody can build a four-wheel drive military vehicle that light. The engines alone weigh too much, and the Army wants a running prototype delivered in 49 days. 49 days. Blank sheet of paper to a working vehicle on a test track. The Quartermaster Corps sends the specification out to roughly 135 American automobile manufacturers. Every company that could conceivably build such a thing. It is one of the widest solicitations in the history of American military procurement. And here comes the first shock of this story. 132 of them do not answer. They read the specification. They look at the weight limit. They look at the deadline. And they throw it in the trash. Because they are running civilian production lines. Because they are booked out for the next model year. Because it is not worth the engineering cost to bid on a contract they will probably lose. Because they do not believe the vehicle can be built at all. Only 3 companies write back. Willys, Overland, a mid-sized firm out of Toledo, Ohio, that makes cheap passenger cars and has been losing money for years. Ford, Industrial Giant, Dearborn, Michigan, the largest automotive manufacturer in the country, and a company called the American Bantam Car Company, Butler, Pennsylvania. You have never heard of them. Almost nobody has, even in 1940. Bantam is a tiny operation. It has been building licensed copies of a small British economy car under an American brand. It is nearly bankrupt. It has laid off most of its engineering staff. The floor is quiet. Size of Ford. It does not have the resources of Willys. On paper, It should not even be in the room, but it answers the call. The president of Bantam knows perfectly well that his company cannot survive another year of civilian sales associated with this military contract. If he can get it, will save the firm. He tells the army, yes, we will bid. We will build the vehicle. We will meet the deadline. The phone. He realizes he has no idea how. Bantam does not have an engineering department capable of designing a four-wheel drive military scout car from scratch in 49 days. Nobody does. That is why the other 132 companies said no. So Bantam does the only thing it can do. The phone again. Calls Detroit. Come. The man on the other end of the line is a freelance automotive engineer named Karl Probst. Probst is not a household name. He is not now, and he was not then. He is a working professional in the American auto industry, based in Detroit, the kind of man who takes contract jobs when the big manufacturers do not have full-time work. Competent. He is experienced. He is, at that moment between jobs, explains the situation. Possible weight limit. Impossible deadline. Save the company contract. Would he be willing to come to Butler, Pennsylvania and lay out a complete vehicle design in the time available? And Karl Probst at first agrees to work without pay. But again, does it matters? The man who designs the vehicle that George Marshall will later call America's greatest contribution to modern warfare initially agrees to do the work for no money. Because the company that has hired him cannot afford to pay him until they win the contract. They cannot win the contract without his drawings, and gets in his car, drives to Butler. He arrives at the Bantam plant and sits down at a drafting table. Begins. He works fast. There is no time for elegance. He borrows off-the-shelf components wherever he can, because designing new parts will kill the schedule. He specifies a Continental four-cylinder engine, roughly 45 horsepower. He specifies drivetrain components from other American truck makers. He lays out the frame, the suspension, steering, the transfer case. The entire vehicle. Does it in about 5 days. 5 days for a complete military vehicle design. A design that will, in slightly modified form, be built more than 600,000 times over the next 5 years, and used by every allied nation on Earth. Drawings go to the Bantam shop floor. The workers start cutting metal. They work day and night. They meet supplier deliveries in the parking lot, parts by hand, where suppliers cannot deliver in time. And on the 49th day after the specification was issued, on the 23rd of September 1940, Bantam drives a running prototype through the gates of Camp Holabird, Maryland, under its own power. On time, the Army tests it, works, meets the specification. Not perfect, it is a little overweight, has some rough edges. It runs, it steers, it climbs, and it does everything the Army asked for. 49 days, a nearly bankrupt company, by one freelance engineer working, at first for free. You would think this is the moment where the story rewards them, where American Bantam gets the contract that saves the company, where Karl Probst gets his name in the history books, where the little firm from western Pennsylvania becomes the manufacturer of one of the most famous vehicles of the 20th century. You would be wrong, because what the United States Army does next is going to make a lot of people uncomfortable, and it is going to explain everything about why, 3 years later, in a canvas tent in Tunisia, a German engineer picks up a bolt with the letter F on it and understands that the war is already lost. Camp Holabird, Maryland, September of 1940. Karl Probst's prototype is parked on the test grounds. Army officers walk around it. They open the hood. They climb inside. They take it out over the rough courses that the Quartermaster Corps has laid down over the years to break vehicles that lesser men promised would not break. It's not break, because for the men of American Bantam who have driven down from Butler to watch, this should be the moment. This should be the moment where they receive the contract. where they save their company, where they become the manufacturer of the vehicle that will carry the United States Army into whatever war is coming. That is not what happens. The Army takes Karl Probst's drawings, complete design, every specification, every dimension, every part number that Bantam has worked out over 49 sleepless days. The Army hands those drawings to Willys Overland. The Army hands those drawings to Ford. And Army tells those two much larger companies to go build competing versions. But again, because it is one of the coldest decisions in the history of American military procurement. Bantam did the work. Bantam met the impossible deadline. Bantam delivered the running vehicle, and Bantam's reward for saving the Army from its own specification is to watch the Army give the design to two competitors who did not do any of it. Now, there is a reason the Army did this, and it is not a good reason, and it is not a bad reason. It is a cold structural industrial reason. The Army looked at Bantam, and the Army looked at the factory floor in Butler, Pennsylvania. The Army did the math, and the Army knew that when the war came, and it was coming, Bantam could not build enough of these vehicles. Not by a factor of 10. Not by a factor of 100. The little firm from western Pennsylvania could produce a few thousand. The Army was going to need hundreds of thousands. So the Army did what industrial armies do. It took the design away from the people who created it and gave it to the people who could scale it. Bantam built a couple of thousand of the early cars called the BRC-40, and then Bantam spent the rest of the war building trailers. Small two-wheeled hitch-mounted trailers. That is what became of the company that answered the call when 132 others said no. That is what became of the company that hired Karl Probst and paid him, eventually, after the fact. The firm never recovered. Hold on to that, because this is what the whole story is about. The decision that killed Bantam is the same decision that won the war. And to see why, you have to watch what happens next. Willys Overland, Toledo, Ohio, takes the Bantam design. Prove it. Not by much and not in any glamorous way, but they improve it in the one place that matters, the engine. Bantam had specified a Continental 4-cylinder unit, off the shelf, about 45 horsepower. Adequate, not exciting. Willys had their own engine, a 4-cylinder side valve design that their own engineers had been developing for years. They called it the Go Devil, produced about 60 horsepower. Not by any measure a masterpiece of engineering, not exotic, sophisticated, but rugged, simple, significantly more powerful than what Bantam had used. Army tested the Willys version. The Willys version was better. Not because Willys was more clever than Bantam, but because Willys had a better engine sitting in inventory. The Army standardized on the Willys design. Officially, it became the Model MB. Then the Army turned to Ford. Listen carefully, because what the Army said to Ford is the sentence that this entire story is built on. The Army did not say, build a Ford version of this vehicle. The Army did not say, use your own components. The Army did not say, adapt it to your factory. The Army said, build this to these drawings, to these tolerances, these specifications, every part interchangeable with every other part. Every bolt fits every hole, every bearing fits every housing, every water pump fits every engine block, whether the water pump came from you or whether it came from Willys. Ford called the vehicle the Model GPW, but the Willys MB and the Ford GPW were not two vehicles. They were one vehicle built in two factories by two companies who did not particularly like each other, 400 miles apart. This is what the German engineer, 3 years later, the tent in Tunisia, will pick up in his hand and turn over slowly and understand. Because now let us actually look at what came out of those two factories. Jeep, as it entered mass production in early 1941, weighed about 2,400 pounds. Its wheelbase was 80 inches. 4 grown men could lift the corners and physically rotate the vehicle on the spot. No armor, no standard mounted weapon. Its windshield folded flat down onto the hood. Its canvas top was usually thrown away by the crews who received it because they wanted the visibility more than they wanted the shelter. And here is the part that matters. Look at the machinery. The engine was ordinary. The Go Devil was a solid, rugged, side-valve, 4-cylinder unit that would have been unremarkable in a 1935 sedan. The transmission was not as refined as a German transmission. Any Wehrmacht engineer with a set of calipers would have told you that. Metallurgy was ordinary. It were rough. The machining tolerances, by the standards of a Stuttgart or a Munich workshop, were loose, sloppy, loose. There is a difference. If you had walked into the office of an engineer at Stower or at BMW or at Daimler-Benz in 1941, and you had put a Jeep on the sidewalk outside, and you had asked him to design a better light military 4-wheel drive vehicle, he could have done it. He would have enjoyed doing it. Preach. He would have produced a beautifully engineered vehicle with tighter tolerances, better metallurgy, a more sophisticated transmission, and probably a more elegant chassis. And that vehicle would have lost the war, because the Jeep was not designed to be best light military vehicle in the world. It was designed to be the most repairable one, and those two goals are not the same goal. They are in fact opposed, and in the entire war, only one country made peace with that opposition. To understand why, you have to leave the 1940s entirely. You have to go back 120 years. Harper's Ferry, Virginia, Armory, the 1820s. Men working here are making rifles. But they are doing it in a way that has never been done before in human history. And they are doing it because they have no choice. Europe, at this point in the 19th century, has a massive advantage over the United States. Europe has craftsmen. Europe has generations of trained gunsmiths, watchmakers, machinists, toolmakers. Europe has men whose fathers were craftsmen and whose grandfathers were craftsmen. The great workshops of London and Birmingham and Leeds and Sewell are staffed by men who spent 7 years as apprentices before they were allowed to touch the good tools. The United States has none of that. States is a young country. It has almost no craft tradition. What craftsmen it does have are scattered across a vast continent. And when the young republic tries to arm itself, it discovers that it cannot pay European wages, cannot import European craftsmen in sufficient numbers, and cannot train them fast enough at home. The Americans do something desperate. They try to build a rifle, not by hiring more craftsmen, but by taking the skill out of the man and putting the skill into the machine. The man who does the most to make that idea real is named John Hall. John H. Hall, a cabinet maker and gunsmith from Portland in what was then the District of Maine. He arrives at Harper's Ferry Armory in 1819 with a contract, an idea, and almost nothing else. His idea is not to build rifles the way rifles have always been built. His idea is to build rifles the way nobody has ever built anything. He is going to design the machines first. Then he is going to let the machines make the parts. Yes, and every part will be identical to every other part of the same kind, because it will have been made by the same machine, to the same jig, held to the same gauge. For years, the older gunsmiths at Harper's Ferry laugh at him, think he is a crank. They think he is wasting government money. They think what he is trying to do is impossible. They have spent their whole lives filing and fitting individual parts by hand, and they cannot see how a machine can replace what a trained man can do with his eyes and his fingers. By 1824, Hall has proven it. He has built a workshop where rifle parts made in one building can be shipped to another building, assembled by workers who have never seen the parts before, and every rifle works. Every part fits every rifle. Nobody has to file anything. Nobody has to adjust anything. Tolerance is in the machine. It is called the American system of manufactures. It works. By 1854, the American armories are producing rifles at rates that European gunsmiths cannot match. And the parts are to a level of tolerance that had never been achieved anywhere in the world before. Interchangeable. The British notice. In 1854, the British government sends a parliamentary commission across the Atlantic. Real serious men, engineers, ordnance officers, members of parliament. If their assignment is to go to Springfield Armory in Massachusetts and to Harper's Ferry, and to figure out how the Americans are doing this. Bring the knowledge home. Write a report. In English. The report is published. Secret. It is available to any European government, any European industrialist, any European engineer who cares to read it. The British take the report and they act on it. They retool the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield in London using American machine tools imported from Massachusetts. The Enfield rifle, which the British Army will carry through the Crimean War and beyond, is built on American principles. Germans read the report too. That is the twist that hangs over this entire story, because we are told over and over that German engineering is the finest in the world, that German precision is unmatched, that German industry in the first half of the 20th century is the most sophisticated on earth. And all of that is true. Yes, but the specific idea of building complex objects out of fully interchangeable parts so that any assembly worker anywhere can put them together without adjustment was published in English, available to any German engineer 89 years before Kasserine Pass. Germany did not miss it. Germany read it, and Germany chose not to build its industrial culture around it. Why? Because Germany, unlike the United States in the 1820s, had craftsmen. Germany had a deep, ancient, unbroken tradition of skilled metalworking that went back to the medieval guilds. Germany, the craftsman was not a weakness to be designed around. The whole system was built around him, and when a factory needed to produce something complicated, you hired more craftsmen. That was the German answer. That had always been the German answer, right up until it stopped working. Which brings us to 1938, Berlin, late in the year, the German Army High Command. By the late 1930s, the Wehrmacht has a problem, and everyone inside the General Staff knows it. The German Army's motor transport is a catastrophe. Not because German trucks are bad. German trucks are very good. The problem. There are too many kinds of them. Germany, in the 1930s, has a proud landscape of independent automotive firms. Daimler-Benz, BMW, Opel, Auto Union, Stoer, Hanomag, Bussing. Each firm has its own engineering culture, its own foundry practices, its own idea of what a good truck looks like, and each firm has been selling its own designs to the Wehrmacht for years, in whatever variety the Wehrmacht happened to order that quarter. The result is a spare parts catalogue that no army on earth can actually run on. There are dozens of truck models in service, hundreds of variants, thousands of different components. The mechanics in the field cannot possibly stock parts for all of them. Yes, the supply columns cannot possibly carry them. And when a truck breaks down in Poland or in France or later in Russia, more often than not, the correct spare part is not available. Not because Germany has not made the part, but because the part is sitting in a warehouse in a city 800 miles behind the front, and there is no way to get it forward. The generals know. They know exactly. They have been complaining about this for years, and in late 1938, the German High Command finally does something about it. Appoint a general named Adolf von Schell. Von Schell is roughly 45 years old at this point. He is a career officer. Motor transport is his specialty. Given a title, plenipotentiary for motor vehicles. It is one of the most powerful industrial titles in the Third Reich. Given authority, given a mandate. It's simple. Fix it. Take the chaotic catalogue of German trucks and cars. Slash it. Cut the number of approved models drastically. Force the industry down to a small standardized range that the army can actually maintain in the field. And now we come back to the tent in Tunisia. 2. The engineer holding the bolt with the letter F on it. This is why he stands there in silence and understands the entire war in the space of 4 seconds. Because those men standing at that bench had lived through this. They had watched the shell plan. They had believed in it. They had thought finally Germany was going to solve this problem, and they had watched it fail. Some of the reduction happened on paper. In the offices in Berlin, model numbers were struck out, approved lists were shortened, diagrams were drawn showing the new, rationalized German motor pool. And then Germany went to war. And Germany conquered. Poland fell. Then Denmark and Norway. Then the Netherlands, Belgium, then France, Slavia, and Greece. Conquest pulled captured enemy vehicles into the German inventory. Renault trucks, Czech Skoda vehicles, Polish rolling stock, Belgian and Dutch supply vehicles, later Italian and Russian. Each of these vehicles had its own parts, its own bolt threads, its own tooling requirements, its own maintenance procedures. And behind each of them there was no supply chain, because the countries that had built them were now occupied and their factories had been converted to German production or bombed into rubble. Shell plan drowned. Not because it was a bad plan, because German success made it impossible to execute. And by the time the Wehrmacht crossed the Soviet border in June of 1941, the German army had become the most heterogeneous motor pool in the history of warfare, and it was about to invade the largest country on earth. Here is a number. Sit with it for a moment. Reach. The German army that invaded Russia in June of 1941 brought with it upward of 600,000 horses. 600,000. Not because the Germans were backward. Not because the Germans could not build trucks. The Germans could build magnificent trucks. Because the Germans could never build enough of them. And because the trucks they did build could not be kept running long enough in Russian conditions to replace the horses. Over the course of the war on the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht used something in the region of 2.75 million animals, horses, mules, oxen, because there was never, at any point in the war, enough motor transport to go around. If you have never seen a picture of a horse-drawn German artillery piece from 1942, find one. Look at it. Look at the animal in harness. Look at the driver in a Wehrmacht greatcoat walking beside it in the mud. And then remember that this is the same army that people describe as the most mechanized fighting force in Europe. It was not. That is the myth. Reality was horses. Millions of them. Because the trucks that were supposed to replace them either did not exist or had broken down or were sitting somewhere waiting for a spare part that would never arrive. Now compare that to a factory in Toledo, Ohio, running 24 hours a day, producing hundreds of Jeeps every single day, every part interchangeable, with every part from a second factory in Dearborn, Michigan. War is the entire war in one comparison. But the Germans did try. They tried harder than most people realize. And the object they built to try has a name that tells you everything you need to know. The Wehrmacht designed a purpose-built light military four-wheel drive car. Their answer to the Jeep, though it was designed before the Jeep existed. They called it the Leichte Einheitspersonenkraftwagen. Einheit, a German word for unit, uniform, standardized. The name of the vehicle translated is the standardized light car. Here is what they did with it. Because the vehicle whose entire purpose was to be standardized was, in the actual event, built by 3 different manufacturers: Stower in Stettin, BMW in Munich, Hanomag in Hanover. 3 firms, 3 factories, and each of them used a different engine. That again, the vehicle called the standardized car was built with 3 different engines by 3 different companies. The parts in practice did not interchange between manufacturers. The name meant standardized. The object was not, and it was complicated. The early versions of the Einheits PKW had 4-wheel steering, beautiful engineering, which is exactly the kind of clever mechanical solution that German engineers loved to design, and which was an ongoing nightmare of maintenance in the field, because the additional linkages and joints in the steering system required constant attention and had many more failure points than a conventional design. Heavy, it was expensive, slow to build, and by 1943 the Wehrmacht cancelled it, fell back on a cheaper alternative, Ferdinand Porsche's Kübelwagen, built on the platform of the pre-war Volkswagen sedan. Air-cooled, so there was no radiator to freeze in Russia. Simple, light, genuinely good across country for a 2-wheel drive vehicle. Do not misunderstand. Kübelwagen was not a failure. It was a competent piece of engineering, but it was 2-wheel drive. And they built about 50,000 of them. 50,000 Kübelwagen against 647,000 Jeeps. Roughly 360,000 from Willys. Roughly 277,000 from Ford. Every single one of them, whether Willys or Ford, interchangeable with every other one, part for part, bolt for bolt, to unit cost under $1,000. 50,000 against 647,000. That is the ratio that decides the war. And under that ratio, underneath the numbers, there is a deeper thing. There are 2 completely different philosophies about what it means to repair a machine. This, in the end, is what the German engineer in the tent understood when he set the bolt down. In the German tradition, and this is a great tradition, one of the greatest engineering traditions in human history, repair is a skilled act. A trained man arrives at the broken machine. Fault. He identifies the failed component. And if the replacement part he has been sent does not quite fit, because the part was made in a different factory, or a different batch, or to slightly different tolerances, he makes it fit. He files, scrapes, shims. He may fabricate the replacement himself from raw stock. The craftsman is not an inconvenience in the German system. Craftsman is the entire system, and the machine is designed on the assumption that he will always be there. In the American system, repair is a transaction. Identify the failed assembly, remove the failed assembly, fit the new assembly. Nothing is adjusted. Nothing is filed, scraped, because nothing needs to be adjusted or filed or scraped, because the tolerance was already handled 4,000 miles ago by a machine in Ohio. Both systems work. Only one of them survives being shipped 4,000 miles. Because craft repair requires craftsmen, years to train, and by 1944 Germany was feeding its trained men into the infantry, because it had run out of infantry. The men who could have repaired the trucks were dying in trenches on the Eastern Front. Craft repair requires a workshop, tooling. Craft repair requires time. And Allied air power had made daylight movement lethal and had destroyed the rail network that connected the forward units to the rear workshops. No time. There was no workshop. There was no tooling that had not been bombed. Transaction repair, the American way, requires a crate, a wrench, kid. Germany could not switch to the American system in the middle of the war, because interchangeability is not a decision you make about a vehicle. Interchangeability is a decision you made 40 years earlier about your machine tools, gauging standards, about your inspection procedures, the entire culture of your industrial base, about whether the individual craftsman matters more or whether the identical part matters more. Germany had made that decision. Germany had made it a long time ago. By 1943, the decision was closed. So the Germans did the next best thing. They used the jeeps. Captured jeeps were treasured across every front, driven by German units in North Africa, in Italy, in France, on the Eastern Front, running as long as the spares held out. It was not long-ish, because the one thing you cannot capture is the wooden crate that arrives at the American depot every week, full of identical replacement parts made on identical machines in Toledo and Dearborn. The Germans could steal the vehicle. They could not steal what stood behind it, and that is what the engineer in the tent in Tunisia understood, holding the bolt with the letter F on it. He was not looking at a car. Creech. He was looking at 120 years of American industrial decisions. Decisions that a British commission had reported on in 1854. Decisions that his own government had tried to imitate in 1938 under a general with the authority to force it. Decisions that Germany had understood perfectly, had analyzed clearly, and had failed to make. The bolt down on the bench, and somewhere in the desert wind he understood what was coming. The details. Not the 2 more years of fighting. Not the specific battles and the specific losses, but the shape of it. The war was going to be decided by the crate and the wrench and the kid. Germany did not have the crate. Normandy, July of 1944. A hedgerow, one of the thousands that cut this part of France into a maze of green walls. Thick earth banks topped with tangled brush that has been growing since before the American Revolution. You cannot see over them. You cannot see through them. And behind each one there might be a German machine gun waiting. An American jeep is parked in the shadow of one of these hedgerows. The engine is silent, not by choice. Something has broken. It could be the water pump. It could be the distributor. It could be a half shaft snapped by... Beating this vehicle has taken over 3 weeks of driving across French farmland that was never meant for anything heavier than a horse cart. The driver is 19 years old. He's not a mechanic. 18 months ago he was driving a delivery truck for a grocer in a small town in Missouri. He had never fired a rifle. He had never been outside his state. He had never seen the ocean until the army put him on a troop ship in New Jersey and pointed him east. He kneels next to the jeep. Creech. He opens a wooden crate that the supply sergeant handed him that morning. Inside the crate is a new water pump, wrapped in oiled paper, stamped with a part number. Not check the part number. He does not need to. He does not look to see whether the broken pump on the vehicle was built in Toledo, Ohio by Willys Overland, or in Dearborn, Michigan by Ford. He does not check whether the replacement in the crate came from the same factory as the original. He does not compare tolerances, does not measure anything, does not shim anything, he does not file anything, takes the broken pump off, the new pump on, the bolts. 20 minutes later, the engine turns over, the jeep runs, drives to wherever the next man needs him to be. Story. That is the entire war, compressed into one 19-year-old kid in a French hedgerow with a wrench and a wooden crate. Because there is only one jeep. There's only ever been one jeep. Every part in every crate fits every vehicle in every hedgerow in every field in Europe. Because a decision was made about that 4,000 miles away and 120 years earlier, and by that decision has become so normal that nobody thinks about it anymore. Kid does not know he is living inside a doctrine. He just knows the pump was broken, and now the pump is not. Drives away, travel across the front line, to the other side, to a German position a few miles east, because they have jeeps too. They have a lot of jeeps. Every German unit that has fought the Americans, from Tunisia to Sicily to Italy to Normandy, has captured jeeps. Every one of those units has learned the same thing. The captured American vehicles are better than the German ones. Not more elegant, not more refined, just better at the actual job of moving men and equipment across broken ground without breaking down, so that the Germans use them. Panzer reconnaissance units drive captured jeeps. Officers drive captured jeeps. Supply columns in Italy drive captured jeeps. There are photographs of jeeps with German crosses painted on the hoods and German license plates bolted to the bumpers. There are unit logs recording maintenance schedules for American vehicles inside German companies. The Jeep, the enemy's little ugly car, has become a prized possession across the entire Wehrmacht. They keep them running for a while, because here is what breaks them. Not the vehicle. The vehicle keeps working. The engine keeps turning. The transmission keeps shifting. What breaks is the parts. The Germans can capture the Jeep. They cannot capture the crate. That is the twist that ends the whole thing. That is the moment where the German dream of matching American industrial production dies is in a supply yard, somewhere behind the lines. Because the vehicle is only half the system. The other half is the wooden crate full of interchangeable parts that follows every American unit forward, replenished by a supply chain that stretches back across the English Channel, across the Atlantic Ocean, all the way to Toledo and Dearborn, where the machines keep running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, stamping out identical components that fit any Jeep, anywhere, forever. Germans have no such crate, so the captured Jeeps run for a few weeks-ish, a few months if the unit is lucky and takes care of them. Then one day the water pump goes, or the distributor fails. Half shaft snaps. There is no replacement, no wooden box. There is no supply column bringing a new one up from the rear, and the officer who was proud of his American vehicle stands next to it in a French farmyard, and he understands. He is not looking at a broken Jeep. He is looking at the entire architecture of the war. Years later, after the surrender, after the prison camps, after the long slow return to a Germany that no longer existed, some of these men would talk about it. Not often. Not to journalists, but to their sons. In workshops in the 1950s and 60s, over cups of coffee that had gone cold, they would say something like this. There was a little American car. Ran and it ran and it ran. Better than anything we had. Better than we thought was possible. And one day it did not run. Because everything we needed was in a box that was on the other side of the ocean. And we had spent 5 years learning that no matter how hard we worked, we could never build a box like that. Some of those sons became engineers themselves in the new West Germany. Some of them went to work at Volkswagen, at Mercedes, at BMW. And when their fathers told them that story in a workshop in Stuttgart or Munich in 1960, they listened, stood. The way they built cars after that was different from the way their fathers had built cars before the war, because they had learned the lesson that Germany refused to learn in 1938, that sometimes the object matters less than the ability to replace it. Now, come with me to December of 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Bulge, the last great German offensive in the West. Hitler has thrown everything he has left into one final gamble. Push through the Ardennes, split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, force a negotiated peace. It will not work, but before it fails, it will surprise the Americans badly, and it will produce one of the strangest operations of the entire war. His name is Otto Skorzeny, 36 years old, Austrian by birth, 6 feet 4 inches tall, with a dueling scar running down the left side of his face from his student days in Vienna. He is an SS lieutenant colonel, and in September of 1943 he became famous across Germany for leading the commando raid that rescued Benito Mussolini from a mountaintop hotel in the Italian Alps. Hitler likes him. Hitler trusts him with unusual missions. In late 1944, Hitler gives Skorzeny his strangest mission of the war. he is to take a brigade of German commandos, to dress them in captured American uniforms. He is to put them in captured American jeeps, and he is to drive them through the American lines during the opening hours of the Ardennes offensive, to spread confusion, cut telephone lines, to redirect traffic, and generally cause chaos behind the front. The brigade is called Panzer Brigade 150, built in a hurry. English-speaking German soldiers are recruited from across the Wehrmacht, though many of them speak only broken schoolboy English. Uniforms are gathered from prisoners of war. Jeeps, captured, repainted with American markings, checked over by mechanics who have spent months learning how to keep the enemy's vehicles running. On the 16th of December, 1944, when German offensive begins, Skorzeny's men drive out into the snow. Works. Small teams in jeeps slip through the American positions in the confusion of the opening attack. Wires. They turn road signs the wrong way. Spread rumors. They cause a level of panic in the American rear that far exceeds their actual numbers. And then the Americans figure it out. As word spreads, there are Germans behind the lines, Germans in American uniforms, Germans in American jeeps. Every checkpoint on every road across the American sector goes on alert. The American sentries, most of them draftees, most of them young, most of them not particularly sophisticated soldiers, come up with a countermeasure that is so American it belongs in a museum. They start asking questions. Not questions about military codes. Not questions about unit designations. Not questions that a well-briefed German spy could have prepared for. Baseball. Who won the World Series? What is the capital of Illinois? Who is Betty Grable married to? What team does Joe DiMaggio play for? Sing the second verse of the Star-Spangled Banner. Across. The German commandos who have been trained to memorize American military rank insignia and infantry tactics freeze. Because you cannot cram American popular culture out of a briefing document. You cannot fake the accumulated small change of an American childhood. You cannot pretend to have grown up listening to the Cardinals on the radio in Missouri, or watching the Dodgers on a summer afternoon in Brooklyn, or arguing with your brother about which team was going to win the pennant. Skorzeny's operation collapses. Most of his men are killed or captured within a few days. Some are shot as spies, because that is what the laws of war do to soldiers caught in enemy uniform. The mission achieves almost nothing of military value. But look at what has just happened. Look at what it actually means. The Germans stole the vehicle, stole the uniform, stole the language, or thought they did. They could not steal what stood behind the vehicle. They could not steal the culture that produced it. Preach. They could not steal the country that made a 19-year-old kid from Missouri who knew, without thinking about it, who won the World Series. The Jeep is not just a Jeep. Jeep is what the Jeep comes from. That, in the end, is the verdict on the whole war. Because when you strip all of it down, every battle, every campaign, every industrial statistic, what you find at the bottom is two different questions being asked by two different countries. German engineering asked, how good can we make this object? American engineering asked, in how many places, by how many people, how little skill, can this object be put back into service? Those are different questions. The second one sounds smaller. It is not. The second question contains a hidden assumption that the Americans made and the Germans could not afford to make. The assumption that the war would be fought a very long way from the factory by people who had never worked in one. Kids from Missouri, kids from Brooklyn, kids from farms in Tennessee who had never held a wrench until the army handed them one. The whole American war rested on the idea that those kids, with a crate and a wrench and no training, could keep the machines running. The Germans built machines that required craftsmen. The Americans built machines that required nobody in particular. By that measure, the Jeep is one of the most successful designs in the history of engineering, and there is almost nothing clever about it. Four-wheel drive was not new. The engine was ordinary. The body work was flat panels, because flat panels are quick to press. The genius of the vehicle is not in the vehicle at all. It is in the fact that the thing that came out of the Ford plant and the thing that came out of the Willys plant were, down to the level of a single bolt, the same object. That is the whole invention. That is the entire miracle. When the war ended, Dwight Eisenhower was asked which tools had won it. He was the supreme Allied commander. He could have named anything. He could have named the Sherman tank. He could have named the P-51 Mustang. He could have named the atomic bomb. 4 things. The bulldozer, the Jeep, 2.5-ton truck, 47 transport aircraft. Not one of them fires a shot. Every single one of them exists to move something from one place to another. Dirt, men, cargo, supplies. That is what Eisenhower thought had won the war. Not the killing, the moving. George Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, called the Jeep America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. Ernie Pyle, the war correspondent from Indiana, who spent more time riding in Jeeps than almost any American journalist alive, wrote that the vehicle was as faithful as a dog, strong as a mule, as agile as a goat. Now we come to the end. Part of the story that has no music in it. Karl Probst, the freelance engineer from Detroit who designed the Jeep in 5 days, initially for no pay. He is not a household name in any household in America. Most people who have driven a Jeep have never heard of him. Prout. Most people who own a Jeep today, 75 years later, could not tell you the name of the man who drew it. He went back to his freelance work. He did other things. He died quietly in Detroit in 1963 without a monument. The American Bantam Car Company of Butler, Pennsylvania, the nearly bankrupt firm that answered the call that 132 other companies ignored. That met an impossible deadline with a hired freelancer working at a drafting table for free. That built the first Jeep and drove it through the gates of Camp Holabird on the 49th day. They had their design taken from them. Yes, they spent the rest of the war building trailers, and he never recovered. They tried after 1945 to go back to making civilian vehicles. Work. The market had moved on. The men who had built Bantam had grown old. The industrial capacity of the country had shifted toward the giants. The little firm from western Pennsylvania limped through the late 1940s, and then in the middle of the 1950s it closed its doors for the last time. The plant in Butler that had built the first Jeep in 49 days sat empty. The lights went out. Tools were sold off. And Bantam was gone. 647,000 Jeeps. Every one of them descended through Willys and Ford and 100 modifications, from a design that Karl Probst laid out at a drafting table in Butler in 5 days in the summer of 1940. And the company that made the first one got a trailer contract and then went out of business. It is not a happy ending. Story is not going to dress it up as one, but look closely, because in a strange way this is the most American detail in the entire history. His system did not reward the inventor. System rewarded the copy. System was built to reward the copy. That is what interchangeability is. That is what the American system of manufactures meant when John Hall started building it at Harper's Ferry in the 1820s, and when the Parliamentary Commission from London wrote it up in 1854, and when the Army standardized the Willys design and handed it to Ford in 1941. It is a decision that the individual object does not matter. Extension, the individual maker does not matter, because everything must be replaceable by something identical. That decision cost Bantam its future. It also meant that when a Jeep broke down in a hedgerow in Normandy in July of 1944, a 19-year-old kid from Missouri could could open a wooden box and have it running again in 20 minutes, and drive it to wherever the next man needed to be. Both of those things are true. You do not get one without the other. Now go back, all the way back, to February of 1943, Tunisian desert, to a workbench covered in the disassembled pieces of a small, ugly four-wheel drive American car, to a German engineer, whose name we do not know, holding a bolt in his hand and reading the small stamped script letter F on the head of it. He was not looking at a car. He was looking at 120 years of decisions that Germany had chosen not to make. He was looking at John Hall at Harper's Ferry in 1824, arguing with older gunsmiths who thought he was a crank. He was looking at the Parliamentary Commission of 1854, boarding a ship back to London with a report they knew would change everything. He was looking at Karl Probst at a drafting table in Butler in 1940, working for free because a small company was going to die otherwise. He was looking at the men and women of Toledo and Dearborn stamping out identical components on identical machines 24 hours a day. He was looking at the wooden crate that would arrive in a French hedgerow 18 months later, and the kid from Missouri who would open it without knowing there was any other way to fix a truck. Stood cool in that moment, in that tent, in that desert. The war was already over. It was going to take another 2.5 years for the fighting to catch up, but it was over. Because you cannot beat the crate, and you cannot beat the wrench, and you cannot beat the kid, and you cannot beat the country that made all three of them, working together, without anyone in particular being told what to do. The bolt down on the bench, yes, and the desert wind blew through the tent flap. The sun set over Tunisia, and somewhere on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, in a factory that never slept, the next jeep came off the line.